Hey guys, tonight we begin with something very relatable. Sleep. Or more accurately, how medieval people slept, which turns out to be far weirder than most of us could imagine. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Before electricity, TikTok, and sleep hygiene influences, medieval people approached nighttime with a schedule that would baffle the modern melatonin enthusiast. It was called segmented sleep, a natural two-part sleep cycle, split neatly in half like a stale medieval biscuit. The routine was simple. After sundown, most people turned in early, drifting off into what was known as first sleep. Then, after about 4 hours, they'd wake up deliberately and spend the next hour or two doing what can only be described as medieval midnight multitasking. This wasn't considered insomnia, it was just how sleep worked. The watch period between the two sleeps was seen as practical, useful, and occasionally alarmingly social. People used this time to pray, read religious texts, tend fires, or check their livestock, because nothing ruins your RAM cycle like wondering if your goat is still in the yard. And yes, this was also considered the ideal time for intimacy. Medieval physicians and marriage manuals noted that the body was well rested and calm of mind during this period, which sounds like a polite way of saying too tired to argue. So if you ever thought you were romantic for waking up early to make your partner coffee, just know your ancestors were setting the bar very differently. The second sleep would follow this interlude, lasting until sunrise. Everyone from monks to farmers participated in this nightly rhythm. Even literary figures like Chaucer casually mentioned it, which means that yes, even in medieval literature, people were writing about not sleeping properly. Oddly enough, modern science has suggested that segmented sleep might actually be more natural for humans. The two-sleep cycle aligns with how our circadian rhythms work in the absence of artificial light. So the next time you find yourself wide awake at 2 a.m, don't panic, just whisper, "Ah yes, the watch has begun," and go tend a symbolic fireplace. It wasn't until the industrial era, with factories, gas lamps, and the growing fear of unproductivity, that humans began to enforce the idea of 8 uninterrupted hours, as though sleep were a timed sport. In the medieval world, waking up in the middle of the night wasn't failure, it was the schedule, and everyone was on it, whether they liked it or not. Let's talk about beds, or rather the medieval approximation of them. In today's world, we obsess over thread counts, memory foam, cooling gels, and whether a mattress is cloud-like. In medieval Europe, a bed was often just a pile of stuff that used to be alive, now flattened under the weight of poor sleep and unspoken regrets. The typical peasant bed consisted of a straw mattress known as a pallet. This was literally straw or hay stuffed into a sack of rough fabric, if they had the luxury of a sack. If not, it was just straw on the floor, possibly damp, possibly already claimed by a cat. These pallets were not comfortable, but they were better than nothing, which was the alternative. Straw was cheap, plentiful, and good at insulating against the cold. It was also great at harbouring insects, lice, and the occasional field mouse, which made sleeping and exercising cautious stillness. If it itched, you ignored it. If it bit, you just shifted slightly and hoped for the best. If a family had a bit more money, or at least a functional back, they might elevate the straw mattress onto a wooden frame. This didn't change the sleep experience dramatically, but it did reduce the chances of waking up with beetles in your ear slightly. Linens were a rare treat. Most people slept in the clothes they wore all day. Pyjamas weren't really a thing, and neither was personal space. Whole families, children, parents, maybe a grandparent, all slept together in the same space, sometimes on the same straw pile. If you got too warm, you could always roll into your cousin's elbow. Nobles, of course, had proper beds. Large wooden frames, feather mattresses, embroidered sheets, and canopies to keep out the drafts and hopefully the lice. These beds were so valuable they were passed down in wills. You didn't inherit land. You inherited Aunt Matilda's suspiciously lumpy featherbed. Still, for most medieval folks, a bed wasn't a place of comfort. It was a place to not freeze, to avoid the chickens, and maybe, just maybe, to dream of being rich enough to one day sleep on something that didn't squawk or rustle. When we hear nightcap today, we think of a cosy little drink, maybe something with whiskey, a warm fire, and a questionable decision. But in the Middle Ages, a nightcap wasn't a beverage. It was a hat, a real, tangible, often ridiculous-looking piece of fabric, designed to keep your head from freezing off while you slept. You see, insulation wasn't exactly the strong point of medieval architecture. Stone walls, drafty thatched roofs, and windows made of thin animal horn or oiled parchment didn't do much against the cold. And central heating, that was called a dog. So to keep their heads warm at night, especially since body heat escapes fastest through the scalp, medieval people adopted the humble nightcap. These hats came in all shapes and sizes, but the most iconic version was long and pointed, like something you'd expect on a wizard who moonlights as a chimney sweep. They were usually made from wool, linen, or whatever scrap of warmth could be spared without angering the family goat. For men, it was a practical accessory. For women, it sometimes doubled as a coif or head wrap, which also served the dual purpose of maintaining modesty and covering hair that hadn't seen soap since last Lent. But beyond warmth, nightcaps had social weight too. In some regions, married women were expected to cover their heads at all times, yes, even while asleep, and the cap itself could be embroidered or dyed to reflect a family's wealth or status. Because nothing says success like going to bed with a mini flag on your skull. In more urban settings, the nightcap even became a symbol of being off duty. If you opened your door wearing one, it was a polite medieval way of saying, "I'm not dressed for conversation." And yes, this hat does mean go away. Of course, nightcaps were often paired with nightshirts, which were essentially long, loose tunics. Picture Ebenezer Scrooge, minus the haunted moral lesson. Sleepwear wasn't sexy, but it was practical, itchy, and occasionally flammable. Today, the idea of sleeping next to a stranger is generally limited to red-eye flights, overly ambitious camping trips, or the occasional bizarre Airbnb mix-up. But in medieval Europe, this was completely normal and not at all optional. Let's say you're a travelling merchant, a pilgrim, or just someone whose mule gave up halfway to Norwich. You find an inn, a rare luxury in itself, and ask for a place to sleep. What you get is not a room or a bed, or even a particularly clean floor. What you get is a spot in a bed that's already occupied. Medieval inns operated more like human bunkhouses than modern hotels. Privacy was not expected. If the bed had space, you were sharing it, usually with complete strangers who might snore, talk in their sleep, or have a suspicious number of boils. This was not considered rude, it was just efficient use of resources. Beds could host 2, 3, even 4 travellers, depending on size and social tolerance. In larger cities, you might end up in a dormitory-like hall, with rows of beds and absolutely zero personal space. Snoring contests were unjudged, elbow territory was fiercely contested. Sometimes men and women were separated, but not always. Some inns tried to assign beds by profession. Blacksmiths with blacksmiths, clergy with clergy, thieves with other thieves, allegedly. But often it was first come, first sprawled. And while this might sound like a nightmare to modern germaphobes, back then it was an upgrade from sleeping outdoors with the wolves, the rain, and the occasional peasant uprising. Worried about theft? Many travellers slept with their purse tied to their belt or hidden under their clothes. Others slept on top of their bundles, turning luggage into both pillow and alarm system. If someone moved your bag, it usually meant you were about to wake up poorer. The rich, of course, did not suffer this fate. Nobles travelled with entourages and camped in relative comfort, or demanded their own rooms if an innkeeper valued their roof. In the medieval world, going to bed wasn't just about pulling up a blanket and drifting off. It was a spiritual operation, a nightly gamble where the stakes were your eternal soul. People didn't just sleep, they prepared to potentially die. Hence the popularity of bedtime prayers. Forget lavender spray or calming podcasts. Medieval sleepers wound down with confessions, psalms, and soul-cleansing spiritual clauses, just in case they died somewhere between good night and dawn. The idea was simple. You could die at any moment from illness, fire, demons, or most dangerously, being over 30 in the year 1247. So, you'd better say your prayers, not because it was comforting, but because hell was terrifying, and you didn't want to show up uninvited, unwashed, and spiritually dishevelled. One common version: if I should die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take. Sweet, right? Except it's basically a legal document written by a 7-year-old acknowledging death as a likely bedtime outcome. Many adults had a whole catalogue of prayers for different threats. One for when you were feeling guilty, one for when you thought the devil might be hiding in the rafters, one for plague prevention, which unfortunately aged poorly. Some even prayed to specific saints known for watching over sleepers, kind of like holy bouncers guarding your soul at the club door. The really devout, monks, nuns, and overly anxious nobles, ended their day with Compline, the final prayer service before bed. After Compline they took a vow of silence, which wasn't hard because everyone was already exhausted, underfed, and mildly afraid of the dark. Children were also encouraged to pray, in part because it was good for their souls, and in part because it gave them something to do other than ask why the dog was in their bed again. Parents reminded them that angels were watching, which sounds adorable until you realise it was less guardian angel and more celestial surveillance system. In short, prayer before sleep was less about peace and more about last-minute damage control. Think of it like medieval antivirus software. You hoped it worked, even if you didn't fully understand how. In the modern world, dreams are usually dismissed as random nonsense. Stress, too much cheese, or your brain trying to file paperwork in the dark. But in the medieval world, dreams were taken very seriously, as in eternal consequences serious. Dreams weren't just dreams. They were considered messages from God, saints, the devil, your guardian angel, or possibly that weird relic you kissed last Sunday. Some dreams were divine revelations, others were demonic temptations. Either way, you were supposed to pay attention and possibly write it down or confess it, or fast for 3 days just to be safe. Theologians, monks, and self-proclaimed visionaries spent an alarming amount of time interpreting dreams. Entire texts were dedicated to decoding them. Dreamt of fire might be hell. Dreamt of water could mean purification or drowning. Dreamt of a man with a goat's head juggling fish. You'd better call a priest immediately and possibly move. Medieval people believed that what happened in dreams mattered because your soul was still active while you slept. This meant that your actions in a dream could reveal hidden sins or spiritual weaknesses. That mildly embarrassing dream about stealing a loaf of bread, that might be your subconscious confessing your guilt for real-world gluttony or just hunger. But still, better to confess it anyway, just in case. Monks and nuns often recorded their dreams and shared them with spiritual superiors. Some were celebrated for having holy visions during sleep. Others were quietly told to eat fewer onions before bed. Of course, dreams weren't just spiritual puzzles. They also made excellent plot devices. Medieval literature is full of dream sequences where knights encounter angels, demons, or metaphorical creatures spouting poetry about virtue. Dreams were basically the Netflix of the medieval world, except with more allegory and fewer happy endings. The church predictably was suspicious. Not all dreams were divine, and some were believed to be planted by demons to corrupt the innocent. If you dreamed of something unwholesome, it could mean your soul was under attack, or that you just slept too close to the fireplace fumes again. In modern times, some people let their pets sleep in the bed. It's a cosy, if occasionally smelly, arrangement. In the Middle Ages, however, sharing a bed with an animal wasn't a quirky personal choice, it was a heating strategy. Let's start with the basics. Medieval homes weren't exactly built for comfort. Stone walls, no insulation, draught so aggressive they probably had names. Central heating that was called the family pig. In peasant homes, it wasn't unusual for humans and livestock to sleep in the same room, sometimes the same bed, and very often the same pile of straw. Chickens wandered freely. Dogs curled up at your feet. Pigs snorted softly beside the hearth. And if you were lucky, none of them bit you during the night. This wasn't about affection, though medieval people certainly appreciated their animals. It was about survival. Animals generated body heat. They were warm, dependable, and unlike some relatives, didn't hog the blanket. A large dog could keep your toes from freezing. A cow in the corner might raise the room temperature by a degree or two, which in January felt like a miracle. Medieval homes, especially those of the lower classes, often had just one room for everything: cooking, eating, sleeping, occasionally dying. Everyone, humans and animals alike, made do with the same space. Children might be nestled between parents and a goat. Chicken might serve as an impromptu alarm clock. Hygiene. Let's not ask too many questions. For wealthier families, this wasn't as common. Nobles didn't usually sleep next to livestock, though they might still have lapdogs in bed. Not for heat, but for fashion and flea redistribution. Some castles even had separate sleeping areas for favourite animals, because nothing says power like a dog with its own room and title. There were drawbacks, of course. Animals can be loud, they can wander, and they are not, historically speaking, known for respecting personal space. But medieval people adapted. A hoof in the face at 3 a.m, just part of the bedtime routine. If you've ever had to share a room at a youth hostel and thought this is a bit much, allow us to introduce the medieval monastic dormitory, a place where comfort went to die quietly under a vow of silence. Monasteries didn't believe in personal space or softness or fun, really. The typical dormitory housed dozens of monks all sleeping in a single large room, usually arranged in neat rows like morally upright sardines. Beds, if you could call them that, were often wooden planks, sometimes with a straw mattress if the abbot was feeling generous or it was a feast day. You slept fully clothed, not out of modesty, but because getting dressed in the dark at 2 a.m. for prayers was more painful than just going to bed already prepared. The monastic uniform, including robe, belt and sandals, doubled as spiritual armour and poor insulation. If you got cold, you layered up. If you got hot, well, no, you didn't. There were no pillows, no privacy curtains and absolutely no talking. Silence was enforced, not suggested under the rule of St. Benedict. If you rolled over and groaned too loudly, you might find yourself on chamber pot duty for a week. Snoring, however, was a grey area. You couldn't control it, but if it became disruptive, the Lord might still hold you accountable, or at least your cellmates would. Lighting was minimal, 1 candle maybe. You didn't need to see, you just needed to lie still and not sin. That was the goal. Despite the austerity, monks believed their Spartan beds were training for the afterlife. Preparation for the soul's journey by denying the flesh any excess. Sleep was not a pleasure, it was a necessity, monitored and scheduled like everything else. Some monks even slept sitting up, just to avoid any hint of luxury or dreams or circulation. Compared to this, peasant straw piles and snoring pigs almost seem luxurious. At least the pig didn't judge you. Let's talk about something that would horrify most modern sleepers. Waking up voluntarily at 2 a.m. and not for a bathroom break or a doom scroll, but for prayer. Loud, cold, candle-lit prayer. In medieval monasteries, this was standard practice. Monks and nuns followed a rigid daily schedule based on the canonical hours, which included matins, the first service of the day. And by day, we mean the darkest part of the night, when even the owls were still deciding whether to wake up. The bell would toll, often rung by someone who drew the short straw, and the entire dormitory of robed, sleep-deprived souls would shuffle off to the chapel in silence, and yes, still in full clothing, because monks didn't do pyjamas. The only layering system they believed in was spiritual. Inside the chapel, by flickering candlelight, and under the echo of stone vaults, they would chant psalms, recite scriptures, and try their best not to fall asleep on their feet. Which, incidentally, was a real issue. There are records of monks being punished for dozing mid-prayer, usually with extra chores or more prayers. You fell asleep in matins. Congratulations, you now get to lead the next one. Matins could last an hour or more. Some particularly enthusiastic orders stretched it to 2. Imagine trying to stay spiritually engaged while your stomach reminds you that dinner was a bowl of lentils and a moral lesson, and your body is actively shutting down. After the service, monks would either return to bed for their second sleep, or in stricter orders, move straight into study or manual labour, because nothing says holy discipline like threshing wheat on 4 hours of fragmented rest. Why so early? The idea was to sacrifice comfort and dedicate the first and quietest part of the night to God, uninterrupted by the temptations of daylight, warmth or REM cycles. It was a powerful symbol of devotion, or at least it was, once you got over the numb feet, the candle smoke, and Brother Ambrose's off-key chanting. In the modern world, sleeping alone is often framed as a luxury, a sign of independence, peace, or just an ability to control the blanket. In the medieval world, though, sleeping alone was considered suspicious, impractical, or just downright unsafe. Let's start with the basics. Warmth. Beds, as we've established, weren't exactly toasty. Stone walls and open chimneys didn't do much to trap heat, and central heating was still several plagues away, so people shared beds for body heat, not out of intimacy, but out of basic thermal desperation. Children slept with siblings, parents, and sometimes the neighbour's kid if they were visiting. It was like a sleepover, but nobody asked if you wanted to be there. But beyond warmth, there was a spiritual reason for sleeping in groups. Many people believed the night was when the devil worked overtime. Alone in the dark, your soul might be vulnerable to temptation or worse, possession. Having others nearby created a kind of moral buffer zone. If something went wrong, at least someone would witness it or catch the demon first. For children, being alone at night was practically unthinkable, not just for comfort, but because ghosts, fairies, and wandering spirits were all part of the nightly landscape. Tales warned against solitary sleep as a gateway to mischief and spiritual peril. And unlike today's bedtime stories, these tales didn't end in hugs. They ended in disappearances. Even married couples often shared their beds with children, servants, or random guests. Privacy was not a concept so much as a modern myth. In fact, the idea of two people sleeping alone in a giant bed was so foreign that it would have been considered either wasteful or deeply, deeply suspicious. In religious contexts, even monks often slept communally, and if someone was assigned to sleep alone, it was often for disciplinary reasons. Yes, in some cases, being alone in bed was literally a punishment. Medieval logic. Solitary sleep grants opportunity for sin. Group sleep, public accountability. Next time you're curled up in your own bed with your own blanket, in a room that doesn't smell like goat, enjoy the silence. In medieval times, you'd probably have 2 kids, a sheepdog, and a cousin in there with you, all of them snoring. If you've ever accidentally fallen asleep sitting up in a lecture, a carriage, or a dentist's waiting room, you probably woke up with a crick in your neck and a deep sense of regret. But in the Middle Ages, sleeping upright wasn't an accident. It was a lifestyle. Some medieval folks, particularly the wealthy or religiously devout, chose to sleep propped up rather than lying flat. Why? A few reasons, none of them particularly restful. First, there was a medical belief that lying flat was bad for digestion, the lungs, or the general balance of the bodily humours. In a world where doctors thought a sneeze could rearrange your soul, this logic made perfect sense. Upright sleeping, they believed, helped avoid congestion of the brain, which sounds ominous, but mostly meant, don't drown in your own phlegm. Second, there were spiritual concerns. Lying flat was considered too close to the posture of the dead. You didn't want to confuse God, or worse, attract attention from the angel of death by sleeping in the same position used at funerals. Superstitious? Absolutely. But when your local priest doubled as the community's health consultant, you picked your battles carefully. As a result, people often slept partially reclined, supported by large bolsters, pillows, or the wooden headboard equivalent of a medieval lazy-boy. Nobles sometimes had their beds rigged with angled supports to maintain a semi-seated posture, perfect for digesting one's evening meat pie or fending off surprise demon attacks. Monks took it a step further. In stricter orders, they might even sleep sitting upright on a bench or leaning against a cold wall, with nothing but a hood to muffle the discomfort. It wasn't about health, it was about discipline. If you were too comfortable, you might dream. If you dreamed, you might sin. If you sinned, well, welcome to confession at 5 a.m. Needless to say, this wasn't about quality rest. It was about virtue, discomfort, and mildly confusing theology. Forget haunted dreams or goblins under the bed. For medieval people, the real monsters of the night were already in the sheets. Small, persistent, and entirely uninterested in your prayers. We're talking, of course, about fleas, lice, and the medieval bedroom's unofficial mascot, the bed bug. Let's not sugarcoat it. Hygiene wasn't exactly medieval Europe's strong suit. Baths were rare, laundry was expensive, and soap was sometimes made from substances better left unnamed. Add that to straw-filled mattresses, shared bedding, and the occasional live chicken underfoot, and you've got the perfect environment for an all-you-can-eat pest buffet. Fleas and lice were so common they were practically roommates. Peasants dealt with them daily. Nobles, despite their satin sheets and feather beds, were not exempt. In fact, some richer households had dedicated nitpickers, actual servants tasked with removing lice from their employers' hair and clothing. Imagine that as your job title, Master of the Royal Scalp. Bedbugs, meanwhile, were the silent assassins of medieval sleep. They hid in wooden bed frames, mattress seams, and even the cracks in stone walls, emerging at night to feast like tiny vampires. If you ever wondered why medieval people wore nightcaps and slept fully clothed, it wasn't always about warmth. Sometimes it was pest defense armor. Solutions ranged from mildly effective to impressively deranged. Some households burned strong-smelling herbs like wormwood or tansy to repel bugs. Others slept with garlic, onions, or even ashes in the bed, which may have done little for the pests but certainly kept romance to a minimum. It wasn't just physical discomfort either. Fleas were often seen as symbols of sin or moral impurity, biting reminders of the fall of man and poor bedding choices. Entire poems were written about fleas, some moralizing, some weirdly romantic, because nothing says "I love you" like "let us be united like the flea that bites us both." So, while modern sleep is interrupted by buzzing phones and streetlights, medieval sleep was more likely disturbed by scratching, twitching, and the subtle feeling that something was crawling on your shin. Because it was. We've all had restless nights. But have you ever tried falling asleep while wearing 100 pounds of iron? No. Well, in the Middle Ages, some people did exactly that because apparently nothing says sweet dreams like being prepared to joust in your sleep. Now, to be clear, most people, even knights, didn't regularly sleep in full armour. It was hot, heavy and loud. Trying to roll over in a suit of chainmail is a bit like trying to nap inside a bag of cutlery. But during wartime or in hostile territory, sleeping partially armoured was considered the safer choice. Comfort, optional. Survival, highly recommended. A knight on campaign might remove only his helmet and gauntlets, keeping his mail shirt or breastplate on, just in case enemies decided to stage a midnight surprise party. There's nothing quite like waking up to the sound of hooves and having to suit up while still half dreaming about turnips. In castles under siege, men-at-arms might even sleep with swords or axes at their side, like some very aggressive bedtime security blankets. Shields doubled as pillows, and if the enemy breached the walls, well, at least you wouldn't have to get dressed. Priorities. Of course, sleeping in armour wasn't exactly restorative. Iron isn't breathable, and chainmail has a bad habit of pinching skin. Add cold stone floors, minimal bedding, and the ambient sounds of snoring comrades and crackling torches, and you've got a sleep environment that ranks somewhere below airport terminal on the comfort scale. Even those not in battle sometimes wore light protective gear while sleeping in dangerous regions. Travelling merchants or guards on watch duty might nap in gambers, thick quilted jackets that offered a bit of protection and slightly more padding than the moral support of prayer alone. And lest we forget, armour wasn't exactly subtle. If you rolled over the wrong way, you might clank so loudly that everyone else woke up and assumed the apocalypse had arrived again. In a time when nightly demons, lice infestations and pigs in your bed weren't considered unusual, you might think that sleepwalking was just one more medieval inconvenience. But oh no, it was much more dramatic than that. In the Middle Ages, if you started wandering around in your sleep, people didn't chalk it up to stress or exhaustion. They assumed you were possessed, bewitched, or had unfinished business with the Holy Roman Empire. Sleepwalking, or noctambulation if you wanted to impress the local monk, was poorly understood and often feared. The idea that someone could rise from their straw pallet, shuffle across the room, and stare blankly at a wall was less harmless parasomnia and more devil's rehearsal dinner. Accounts from the time suggest that people were genuinely spooked by sleepwalkers. Picture this: a man in a long nightshirt, candle in hand, eyes glazed, mumbling Latin that he didn't actually speak while stepping over livestock. You'd think ghost or heretic or both. And depending on your local priest, an exorcism might be scheduled before breakfast. Some believed sleepwalking was caused by bad humours, especially too much black bile, which was the medieval catch-all for anything they couldn't explain. Others thought it happened because the soul was temporarily released during sleep, leaving the body free to bumble around like an unattended mule. To prevent these nightly adventures, people tried everything from herbal remedies to praying over their beds, hanging iron charms, or in more rural areas, just tying the person's leg to a chair. If that sounds extreme, consider that some medieval homes had open hearths, knives everywhere, and chamber pots just waiting to be tragically overturned. In one curious twist, there were rumours of people climbing onto rooftops in their sleep. Whether or not these accounts were exaggerated, the fear of leaping dreamers led to barred windows and occasional theological debates about whether a person could sin while unconscious. Thankfully, most sleepwalkers just paced, muttered, or attempted to open imaginary doors. But if someone sleepwalked into a church, locals might treat it as a divine sign or call for a cleansing ritual, just to cover all spiritual bases. If medieval life taught people anything, it was how to sleep through chaos. Church bells, thunderstorms, screaming livestock, the occasional siege. For the sleep-deprived denizens of the Middle Ages, these were just ambient noises, the medieval version of white noise. Let's start with the bells. Church bells marked every sacred moment of the day. Sunrise, prayer times, meals, and of course the ungodly hour of matins at 2 or 3 a.m. If you lived anywhere near a monastery, your dreams were probably soundtracked by regular tolling. At some point, the brain just accepted it. Bells became the lullaby of an overscheduled soul. And it wasn't just bells. Storms were frequent and terrifying. With no weather apps or triple-glazed windows, you experienced every clap of thunder like the world might end. Roofs leaked, windows rattled, and chimneys howled like banshees. Still, people slept. They had to. Work didn't stop for insomnia. Neither did ploughing, praying, or running from Vikings.
While Rome gave us roads, aqueducts, and legal systems, it also gave us some of the most absurd, theatrical, and downright disturbing punishments the ancient world ever saw. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Vestals buried alive. The high price of virginity. In ancient Rome, the Vestal virgins were the spiritual equivalent of national Wi-Fi. If they went down, everything went wrong. These women were handpicked before puberty to serve the goddess Vesta, keeper of the eternal flame. Their job? Keep that sacred fire burning, and more importantly, stay away from men for 30 years. Breaking a vow of chastity in ancient Rome wasn't just frowned upon. It was treated like detonating a nuke in the middle of the Senate. If a Vestal was caught fooling around, the punishment was literally being buried alive. Yes, alive. Not metaphorically canceled, not sent to the naughty corner, straight up entombed underground. Why buried and not, say, executed with a sword like a normal ancient crime? Simple. Romans believed you couldn't spill a Vestal's blood. It would offend the gods. So they found a delightful loophole. Dig a pit, lower her in with a flickering oil lamp, a little bread, and a pitcher of water. Because, hey, hydration matters. Then seal her in. Voila. No blood, no mess, no divine tantrums. The poor girl would lie there in the dark, thinking about her life choices, while Rome dusted off its hands and moved on. You'd think the guys she got caught with would suffer the same fate, but nah, they were usually whipped to death in public. Still brutal, just quicker. To be fair, becoming a Vestal was a big honor. You got front row seats at the games, traveled in fancy carriages, and even had the power to pardon condemned prisoners with a single word. But all of that came with one little catch. Mess up once, and you're sleeping underground permanently. And yes, Rome took it that seriously. One famous Vestal, Cornelia, was accused during Emperor Domitian's reign. Before being sentenced, she reportedly shouted, "Does Caesar think I've had sex with a god then? Because no mortal man touched me." Bold move, didn't work. So if you're ever feeling overwhelmed by your job, just remember, at least your boss isn't threatening to bury you in a hole with stale bread and a dusty oil lamp. Rome, where HR policies were written in stone and fear. Pona Cullae, death in a sack with animal roommates. Ah, ancient Rome, the birthplace of philosophy, architecture, and punishments that sound like fever dreams. Let's talk about Pona Cullae, which translates to penalty of the sack. It's what happened if you committed the ultimate Roman taboo, killing your father. Romans didn't just slap you with a fine or toss you in jail. No, no. If you murdered dear old dad, they gave you the deluxe punishment package starring you and 4 unfortunate animals. First, the Romans would tie your hands, maybe give you a moment to reflect. Spoiler, you'd made bad life choices. Then they'd sew you into a large leather sack. Cozy? Wait for it. Joining you in the sack were a dog, for the loyalty you lacked. A monkey, because why not add chaos? A snake, to slither through your regrets. And a rooster, perhaps to announce your doom at sunrise. Then the sack, now filled with panic and animal rage, was tossed into a river, preferably a deep one. The result? A flailing, screeching, hissing blender of poetic justice. No one really knows why those specific animals were chosen, but historians think it was symbolic. Dogs symbolized family, monkeys chaos, snakes deceit, and roosters vigilance. Basically, your sins made flesh and feathers. Can you imagine the moment inside that sack? You're being headbutted by a monkey while a snake coils around your leg. The dog's losing its mind, and the rooster thinks it's Tuesday. If this sounds like the worst escape room ever, you're not far off. The punishment was rare, thankfully. But Rome revived it occasionally just to make a point, usually under emperors who loved a bit of theater. It wasn't just about killing the criminal. It was about making a statement, and maybe traumatizing a few spectators while they were at it. So next time your dad forgets your birthday, be glad you weren't born in Rome. Back then, patricide didn't mean therapy. It meant sack time with the serpent circus. Next up, crucifixion, but upside down. When we hear crucifixion, most of us think of one thing: a wooden cross, a slow, agonizing death, and a message not to mess with the state. It was Rome's signature punishment, brutal, public, and humbling. But leave it to the Romans to add a creative twist: the inverted crucifixion. Yes, upside down, because apparently, dying upright wasn't humiliating enough. This method was saved for special cases, usually rebels, traitors, or people the authorities really, really wanted to make an example of. The most famous was St. Peter, one of Jesus' 12 apostles. According to tradition, when Peter was sentenced to die by crucifixion under Emperor Nero, he made a strange request: "Crucify me upside down. I'm not worthy to die like my Lord." And Rome, being the efficiency machine it was, said, "Sure, why not?" Now here's where it gets grim. Crucifixion was already one of the worst ways to die, combining asphyxiation, blood loss, and public shame. But flipping the body made it worse. Blood rushed to the head, muscles strained in weird ways. Breathing became nearly impossible, and it hurt. A lot. It's like sitting through a boring lecture, except you're upside down, and someone's driving nails into your ankles. Not quite the same vibe, but this wasn't just about pain. It was about symbolism. The inverted cross later became a symbol of humility. Peter's choice meant reverence, not rebellion. 2 bad horror movies and metal bands gave it a totally different vibe. The Romans didn't care about symbolism. For them, it was all about sending a message. Cross us, and we'll turn your death into performance art. Upside-down crucifixion wasn't just punishment. It was dramatic theater. So next time you're hanging out, hopefully not literally, remember, Rome could turn anything into a spectacle. Now, let's talk about decimation, ancient Rome's version of a team-building exercise. When you think of a motivational speech, you might picture a coach yelling, "We win together, we lose together." But in ancient Rome, it was more like, "We march together, or 1 in 10 of you dies." Welcome to the charming world of decimation. A punishment so brutal, it makes modern boot camp look like a resort. Here's how it worked. If a Roman unit showed cowardice or mutinied, the commander had a nuclear option. Not in the explosive sense, more like psychological warfare. The whole unit was lined up. Every 10 soldiers drew lots. The lucky one? He got beaten to death by the other 9, with clubs, stones, or whatever was lying around. Yes, you heard right. Not only did you risk death, you might have to kill your friend, the guy you drank wine with the night before, all to prove loyalty to Rome. It was like Survivor Roman Legion Edition, except nobody won immunity, and everyone went home traumatized. And don't think the 9 survivors got a break. They were given barley instead of wheat, Rome's way of saying, we're disappointed, and forced to camp outside the fort. The logic? If you feared your comrades more than the enemy, you'd stay in line. And weirdly, it worked. Roman discipline was legendary. Decimation kept soldiers marching, even if they had to step over a few corpses. One of the most infamous examples came from Crassus, the wealthy general who formed a triumvirate with Caesar and Pompey. After a humiliating defeat in the Spartacus revolt, he decimated a disgraced unit. Nothing says, we're back on track, like a casual in-house massacre. So next time your boss talks about team accountability, be glad you're not under Crassus. In Rome, failure wasn't just punished, it was shared. Now, let's get weird. The Fork of Heretics, a medieval neck workout nobody asked for. Imagine living in late Roman times. Things were getting darker, stranger, and very obsessed with heresy. You spoke out against the church? Challenged a sacred belief? Rome didn't scold you. It gave you a fashion accessory you'd never forget. The Fork of Heretics. Picture a metal rod with 2 prongs at each end. One jammed under your chin, the other in your chest. A mini trident clamping your neck. Sounds awful? We're just getting started. Once strapped in, you couldn't move your head at all. Look down? Stabbed. Try to whisper? Stabbed. It didn't draw blood, not at first. That was the genius. The fork wasn't meant to kill you. It was meant to break you, mentally, physically, spiritually. You'd stand for days, muscles aching, trying not to impale yourself. It was a twisted game of don't move, where the prize was not skewering your own throat. And while it was called the Fork of Heretics, it was also used on witches, liars, blasphemers, basically anyone who annoyed a bishop before breakfast. Sometimes they even engraved messages on it in Latin, like I renounce my sin or I am guilty. Because nothing helps a confession like being slowly stabbed by typography. What's wild is this wasn't even one of Rome's worst punishments. It was more like a starter pack for sinners. No blood, no crowds, just quiet misery and internal panic. Heresy 101. So next time you try to hold in a sneeze during a meeting, imagine doing that for 3 days straight, with iron prongs at your throat. In Rome, silence wasn't golden. It was enforced, with rusted forks and divine neck cramps. Thrown from the Tarpeian Rock, Rome's original unfriend button. Forget passive-aggressive texts so dramatic unfollows. In ancient Rome, if you betrayed the state, they didn't just cut you off. They threw you off a cliff. The Tarpeian Rock was an 80-foot drop near the Roman Forum. It wasn't just scenic. It was where traitors were launched to their deaths. Public, final, and full of symbolism. The rock was named after Tarpeia, a Roman girl who betrayed the city to the Sabines in exchange for shiny gold bracelets. The Sabines crushed her with their shields instead, fulfilling the deal literally. Her body was thrown off the cliff, and the rock was named after her. Moral of the story: don't trust invaders or vague payment promises. After that, the Tarpeian Rock became Rome's favorite way to deal with traitors, corrupt officials, and false witnesses. No sword, no rope, just a fall. Condemned people were stripped, paraded, and led to the edge. Gravity did the rest. Crowds gathered. Market days got a bonus show. Rome loved public punishment. It wasn't just about execution. It was about removal from the city, physically and spiritually. The rock stood near Jupiter's temple, so your last moments came with a view of the heavens. Later, more creative punishments arrived, but this one stayed a classic. Simple, swift, brutal. Next time someone says, "He got thrown under the bus," remind them Romans did it better. No wheels, just rock. And now, damnatio ad bestias. Death by lion, applause optional. The Colosseum. Sweat, sand, and 50,000 fans. Ancient Rome's version of live TV, starring wild animals and doomed souls. This punishment, called condemnation to the beasts, was for criminals, rebels, and Christians who refused to worship Rome's gods. It wasn't just about death, it was theater. The condemned were tossed into an arena with lions, leopards, or even elephants. But Rome added flair, costumes. Victims might be dressed as Orpheus, only to be mauled mid-song. Others became Prometheus, pecked by birds in a myth made real. It was entertainment, justice, and propaganda in one. Did they get to speak? No, this wasn't court. It was death with a costume change. The crowd came for blood. If the animals were tired, guards poked them with hot irons or starved them beforehand. You could end up there for theft, political speech, or worshiping the wrong god. Unless the emperor liked you, your fate was sealed. The lions waited. This wasn't mindless cruelty. It was planned to scare the rest. A clear message. This could be you. Rome ruled with fear and claws. Later, Christian martyrs turned these deaths into powerful symbols. But for most, it wasn't about faith. It was about pain. So if jury duty feels annoying, remember some people were forced to dress as myths and dodge tigers. Now let's talk about something more polite. Forced suicide. In Rome, if you were powerful and offended the emperor, you might be invited to take your own life. Politely. Here's how it went. A scroll arrived. You had dishonored the state. You were asked to die with dignity. If you did, your family kept their property. Your name stayed clean. If not, the state killed you and erased your legacy. For the elite, this was a final choice. It wasn't seen as shameful. Many thought it noble. A quiet ending, sometimes even poetic. Think warm bath, blade to the wrist, a final letter. The philosopher Seneca was told to die this way. He obeyed. First the wrists, then the ankles. When bleeding failed, poison. When poison failed, he stepped into a hot bath to speed things up. Less suicide, more chemical experiment. Rome gave the illusion of dignity while making sure disobedience vanished. No trial, no crowd. Just water, steam, and the silent approval of the empire. So next time your boss sends a passive-aggressive email, imagine getting a note asking you to vanish beautifully. Rome didn't always kill you with swords. Sometimes it handed you the blade and asked you to be graceful about it. Death, but politely framed. Let's wrap with the wooden donkey. Ever complain about an uncomfortable chair? Rome had you beat. The wooden donkey wasn't furniture. It was torture. A sharp wooden device shaped like a triangle. Prisoners sat on it naked, with weights tied to their feet. Painful. Effective. One of Rome's more imaginative punishments involved a piece of furniture. The now infamous wooden donkey, or as it should have been called, the pain pony of doom. This device wasn't a real donkey, of course. It was a tall, narrow, sharply angled wooden beam shaped like an A-frame with a razor-thin peak. The condemned, usually thieves, slaves, or rebellious soldiers, were forced to straddle it. That's right. Their entire body weight pressed down on that sharp edge right between the legs. But wait, it gets worse. To really drive the point home, weights were often tied to the person's ankles. Gravity did the rest. The longer you sat, the more the beam tore into your flesh, slowly, painfully. And depending on how generous the executioner felt that day, You might be left there for hours, maybe even longer. The Romans didn't invent the wooden donkey. It likely came from earlier Middle Eastern torture traditions. But Rome embraced it with style. Because if there was one thing they loved, it was punishment with flair. It wasn't always a death sentence. Sometimes it was just public humiliation. Imagine a busy market, a cheating merchant wailing on the donkey, while kids laughed and vendors sold snacks. It was pain, performance, and a life lesson all in one. Even worse, Roman generals sometimes used it as field discipline. Soldiers who disobeyed could end up straddling the donkey to learn a sharp lesson about orders. Some donkeys were made of metal. Some had spikes. One record even mentions a heated version, because Rome was apparently open to feedback and innovation. It was humiliating. It was brutal. And it turned sitting into a punishment that could scar you for life, both physically and mentally. So next time your office chair feels uncomfortable, just remember at least it's not a sharpened triangle with rocks tied to your feet. In ancient Rome, bad posture wasn't your biggest problem. The furniture could punish you back, and you were expected to learn something from it. Now let's talk branding. Not logos, but literal fire on your face. In a world without ID cards or Google, Rome had a simple method for identifying criminals. Burn it onto their skin. If you were a thief, a runaway slave, or a repeat liar, congratulations. You now had a permanent label seared into your face. A heated iron rod was pressed into your skin with all the subtlety of a blacksmith. You might get an F for fur, meaning thief, or a C for calumnia, meaning false accusation. The mark went on your forehead or cheek. Imagine a 1-star review, but it's on your skull forever. And this wasn't done in secret. Branding was public, a show, a lesson to others. It wasn't just punishment. It was propaganda, burning hot and straight into your flesh. Everyone would know who you were. Now imagine trying to live with that mark. You walk through the market, everyone stares. Want a job? Good luck. Want to date someone? Not likely. You weren't just a person anymore. You were a warning sign. Runaway slaves were especially targeted. They were often branded with the letters FUG, short for fugitivus. If they ran again, worse punishments followed. Branding was just the beginning. Runaway slaves got branded with the letters FUG, short for fugitivus, meaning escapee. If they ran again, they got worse. Branding wasn't just punishment. It was a system of control. Some people tried to cover it up with tattoos, scars, or makeup. Rome wasn't having it. Tampering with your brand was also a crime. Like trying to erase your record with face paint. Didn't work. Later, emperors like Constantine tried to make it less harsh. He suggested branding the hands or legs instead of the face. But the message was still the same. Shame forever. So the next time someone says, face your consequences, be glad they don't mean that literally. Because in ancient Rome, they really did. Your face didn't just remember. It told everyone else. Tongue removal for blasphemy. Say goodbye to small talk. In ancient Rome, freedom of speech had limits. You could praise the emperor or recite poetry. But if you insulted the gods or said something wrong in the wrong place, Rome had a solution. They would take your tongue, literally. If your words caused trouble, Rome would silence you, permanently. No anesthesia, no clean tools. Just forceps, hot iron, and a sharp blade. Sometimes they cut the tongue. Sometimes they ripped it out entirely. It wasn't surgery. It was censorship by violence. And it wasn't always about religion. Sure, mocking the gods was risky, but speaking out against the emperor or breaking Rome's moral code could get you the same treatment. One wrong word and your voice was gone. Basically, if your mouth made the powerful uncomfortable, you became an emergency. One joke, one whisper, one chant, and that was it. This wasn't just cruel. It was theatrical. Public tongue removals sent a clear message. Words have power, but Rome's power was greater. Even if you survived, life after was bleak. You couldn't speak clearly. You couldn't scream. You couldn't even explain yourself. It was isolation by mutilation. Not a mark on your skin, but a wound in your silence. Some early Christian martyrs faced this. They kept preaching, and Rome silenced the messenger. But their stories spread anyway. That only made officials angrier. These punishments weren't just about stopping one person. They were about stopping ideas. Rome knew words could start revolutions. So it cut them off. If this all sounds extreme, it's because Rome was obsessed with control. And there's no easier way to control someone than by taking their voice. So next time someone tells you to hold your tongue, be grateful it's just a phrase. Because in Rome, it was a punishment, permanent and bloody. You didn't just lose the right to speak, you lost the ability. Rome didn't debate your opinions. It removed them. Now we come to the wheel. If you thought Rome had run out of nightmare fuel, meet the breaking wheel. Also known later as the Catherine wheel. It wasn't really an execution. It was more like sculpture, but with bones. The victim was tied to a large wooden wheel, arms and legs stretched wide. Then came the iron bar. The executioner smashed each limb, one by one, slowly, carefully, for maximum damage. The goal wasn't to kill, it was to break, snap the arms, crush the legs, twist the ankles until they no longer looked like ankles. The body folded into a horrible shape, but the worst part was still to come. The broken limbs were then threaded through the spokes of the wheel, like some twisted human knitting project. Sometimes the wheel was raised on a pole. Sometimes it was left spinning in the wind. This wasn't just pain. It was a warning. The wheel was for crimes seen as especially vile. Murder, treason, highway robbery. And the message was clear. This is what happens when you go too far. Most didn't survive, but a few did. And if they were still breathing after a day or two, sometimes they were given mercy. A quick final blow, not out of kindness, just to finish the process. Even after Rome, the wheel lived on. Medieval Europe adopted it with glee. They added fire, spikes, and flare. What Rome started, others perfected. So next time your day feels hard, remember you're not being woven into a wooden wheel. Rome believed justice should be seen, and heard, and screamed. It was bold. It was public. It was unforgettable. And it left very little to the imagination. Execution by hot ash. Yes, they even weaponized something as boring as ash. In some cases, prisoners were buried up to their necks, and hot ash was poured over them slowly. The grainy burn suffocated and roasted them at the same time. It was a slow, choking, searing death. Rome didn't just want to end lives. It wanted people to feel every moment of that ending. Because fear made order, and order was everything. When it came to killing creatively, ancient Rome always had something simmering, literally. Enter one of its lesser-known but deeply disturbing punishments. Execution by hot ash. It's not as famous as crucifixion or the lions, but it might be one of the slowest and most psychologically terrifying ways to die. No swords, no bloodshed, no quick release. Just ashes. Heated, suffocating, and endless. This gruesome method is credited, unsurprisingly, to Emperor Nero, a man who treated executions like performance art. In one recorded case, Nero had a man buried up to the neck in a pit. So far, classic Rome. But instead of beheading or stoning, Nero added a twist. A funnel was placed in the man's mouth, and hot ash was slowly poured in. Not boiling water, not fire. Ash. Seems harmless, right? But that's when the real horror begins. The ash is scorching. It clogs the throat, burns the lungs, and suffocates from within. It doesn't kill fast. It strangles slowly. Every breath feels like fire. Every swallow brings you closer to death. And when it's over, there's no blood, no visible wounds, just silence, death by dust. A humiliating, undignified way to go. You weren't even worth a sword, just leftovers from someone else's fire. Ashes were used to clean filth. They were waste. So dying in ash meant you were beneath attention, not worthy of flame, steel, or spectacle. It wasn't a common punishment. It was for enemies Nero really hated, people he didn't just want dead. He wanted them erased in the quietest, cruelest way possible. And to the crowd, it looked almost peaceful. No screaming. Just a man in a pit and a trickle of gray dust. That was the point. No glory, no final words. Just fading away. So next time someone says ashes to ashes, dust to dust, remember that in Nero's Rome, it wasn't poetic. It was policy. Now let's talk about the tunica molesta, Rome's deadliest wardrobe malfunction. Fashion usually doesn't kill, unless you're wearing a tunic soaked in oil and lit on fire. Yes, that happened. You're brought into an arena or strapped to a stake. The executioner brings you a tunic. You think maybe they're showing mercy. Then you notice it's soaked in pitch, tar, and oil. This is the tunica molesta, a literal death robe. Snug, sticky, and ready to ignite. This wasn't just execution. It was public theater, used by emperors like Nero to entertain guests. Human torches lighting his garden parties. Who wore it? Arsonists, traitors, Christians, anyone the state wanted to make an example of. The fire clung to your body. Your skin melted. Your lungs filled with smoke. And you couldn't escape. The tunic stuck to you. It burned with you. Sometimes they even played music during the burning. Nero reportedly played his lyre as people screamed. A hot performance, literally. Rome loved symbolism. The tunic was inspired by the poisoned shirt of Hercules. A myth turned into reality. And the message was clear. Cross the empire, and you'll go out in flames. It wasn't just execution. It was punishment with poetry. Shrieking, flailing, melting poetry. And everyone watched. It was brutal, theatrical, and unforgettable. So the next time your clothes feel tight or itchy, be thankful they're not soaked in oil and part of a show. Because in Rome, fashion didn't whisper. It screamed. Now we come to the final punishment, damnatio memoria. When Rome didn't just kill you, it deleted you. Most punishments ended with the body, but this one reached further, into memory, into legacy. Damnatio memoria means condemnation of memory. If you were a disgraced emperor, a traitor, or a senator who stepped out of line, Rome didn't just execute you. It erased you. Statues smashed, inscriptions chiseled out, paintings scrubbed, names removed from records, coins, and documents, achievements reassigned. You vanished from history like you were never there. And it worked. Some of these people were once powerful, feared, known, but today we don't even remember their names. Rome was that good at deletion. One famous example is Emperor Geta. After his brother Caracalla had him killed, he ordered Geta's face erased from every mosaic and sculpture. In some artwork, you can still see the faint outline where Geta once was. Half faces, scratched names, gaps where people used to be. It's like watching history actively forget. But this wasn't just revenge. It was power. If Rome could erase the past, it could control the future. If they made it look like you never existed, then maybe your ideas didn't either. That was the message. You were nothing. And if anyone said otherwise, they'd be next. It sounds ancient, but it's strangely modern. We talk about cancel culture, deleted tweets, reputations destroyed in hours. Rome was doing it 2,000 years ago. just with chisels instead of hashtags. And as we wrap this strange journey through Rome's punishments, remember this. The cruelest thing wasn't fire, lions, or torture. It was silence, and being forgotten on purpose. Rome didn't just punish your body, it punished your memory. It made sure you were erased from the minds of your people, your face scratched away, your name wiped clean, your story untold. Because in Rome, the worst thing that could happen wasn't paying. It was being made into nothing. And that, to them, was true justice. So next time someone says history is written by the victors, remember that sometimes the losers were completely unwritten, their names lost, their faces erased, their legacies turned to dust. And if you ever wonder how powerful a government can be, just look at how well Rome made people disappear. Not just in life, but forever. In the early 1800s, the American landscape stretched endlessly westward, wild, unknown, and whispering promises to those bold enough to chase them. The East, crowded with cities, factories, and fading farmland, had begun to feel tight, constrictive. But the West, that was the dream. A blank canvas with just enough danger to make the paint stick. It began as a whisper in taverns, in church pews, around dinner tables. Stories of open land, of rivers that shimmered like silver, of valleys that bloomed without effort. The Louisiana Purchase in 1803 had more than doubled the size of the young United States. Suddenly, there was space, unimaginable space, and it belonged to no one. Or so the government claimed. For many, the West was more than a direction on a compass. It was a fresh start, a place where your name didn't carry your debts, where nobody asked where you were from, only what you could do with your hands. It called to dreamers and desperados alike, farmers looking for new soil, widows seeking peace, and adventurers chasing legends carved out of campfire tales. There were no highways, no guarantees, and no second chances. Every journey westward began with uncertainty. Would the wagon survive the mountains? Would the river freeze too soon? Would there be food on the other side? And yet, tens of thousands went. Entire families with infants swaddled in flour sacks and grandmothers tucked between crates of salted pork set off into the unknown. To go west was to gamble everything, but to stay behind felt like surrendering to a life of limits. The frontier wasn't just a place on a map. It was a test of will, of grit, of the ability to carve order out of chaos using nothing but timber, steel, and raw hope. And as the sun sank behind endless prairies and mountain ridges, casting long shadows on wagon wheels and weary faces, one thing was clear. America's story wasn't written yet. It was being dragged slowly westward, one rickety mile at a time. Before the pioneers could brave the wild frontier, they had to build a vessel that would carry not just supplies, but their entire future. Enter the covered wagon, the backbone of the westward migration. It was no stagecoach or fancy carriage. It was a wooden box on wheels held together by sweat, hope, and iron nails. Most families didn't build wagons from scratch. They bought them or modified existing carts. The most famous type was the Conestoga, but on the frontier, something smaller, lighter, and cheaper was needed. That became the prairie schooner, so named because its canvas top, billowing in the wind, looked like a ship sailing across grassy seas. But this ship didn't carry gold or jewels. It carried salted pork, flour, beans, cast iron pots, a spinning wheel, a Bible, and maybe one good quilt. Every inch was accounted for. Space was life, and weight could kill you. A fully loaded wagon might hold up to 2,000 pounds. Any more, and the oxen pulling it would collapse long before you reached the Rockies. Horses were too delicate. Mules were too expensive. Oxen were the true engines of expansion, slow, stubborn, but unbreakable. Families slept in the wagons, under them, or beside them. Privacy was a luxury few could afford. And despite what Hollywood suggests, people didn't ride inside all day. That would jostle bones and bruise backs. Most walked mile after mile, day after blistering day. Wagons weren't just transportation. They were survival pods. They held medicines, spare wagon tongues, gunpowder, and seeds. Some even carried baby chicks in boxes beneath the wagon bed to start a coop once the family settled. And yet, for all their practicality, wagons were also symbolic. They were hope on wheels. Once the oxen were yoked, once the wheels creaked into motion, there was no turning back. The house was sold. The land behind was gone. All that remained was the trail, the sky, and the belief that something better lay ahead. Every bump, every cracked axle, every muddy crossing was one line written in the story of American expansion, carved not in ink, but in wheel ruts and willpower. Life on the trail was not the romantic adventure story some might imagine. It was long, grueling, and soaked in dust. Each day began before sunrise. Roosters weren't needed. The creak of leather harnesses and the groan of wagon wheels were alarm clocks enough. The average wagon train moved about 10 to 15 miles per day, depending on weather, terrain, and how many axles broke that morning. Over time, trails like the Oregon, Santa Fe, and California roads carved themselves into the earth, each lined with discarded belongings, broken wheels, and the graves of those who never made it west. Meals were simple, hearty, and endlessly repetitive. Coffee was a luxury, water a gamble. Streams could be clean or crawling with bacteria. Boiling helped if you had the fuel and time. Otherwise, it was luck and prayer. Food was rationed. Salted meat, hardtack, dried beans, and sometimes wild game if someone could shoot straight. Wild onions and berries became treasured delicacies. Illness was the greatest killer on the trail. Cholera swept through camps like wildfire. It came from contaminated water and killed quickly, often within hours. Sometimes dysentery, scurvy, and snake bites took others. There were no doctors, only home remedies and hope. Sometimes hope wasn't enough. Still, there were moments of joy. Children played with sticks and stones or skipped along the wagon's shadow. Weddings occasionally took place on the trail. So did births. Entire families were forged, not just by blood, but by shared hardship and dust-soaked camaraderie. At night, the wagons circled, not to fend off native attacks, as often mythologized, but for protection against thieves, animals, and cold wind. Fires were lit. Bread was baked on hot stones. Someone might pull out a fiddle. For a few hours, laughter and music pushed back the darkness. But rest was always brief. Tomorrow brought more walking, more wilderness, and fewer guarantees. Life on the trail was survival by routine. You learned to love your boots and hate your blisters. You learned to mourn quietly and move forward anyway, because the land didn't wait for grief. It only moved west. After weeks or even months on the trail, the sight of trees, water, and flatland was enough to make a pioneer fall to their knees in gratitude. But celebration was short-lived, because once a family found their spot, the real work began. Homesteading wasn't glamorous. There were no pre-built homes waiting, no fences, no roads, just open land and the ticking clock of the seasons. The first priority shelter, usually a one-room log cabin, barely large enough to hold the family that built it. Tools were limited, and every log had to be felled, trimmed, and hauled by hand or oxen. No chainsaws, no blueprints, just axes, grit, and guesswork. Most cabins had dirt floors, which turned to mud in the rain and froze solid in winter. Windows were often just holes covered with animal hide, or greased paper to let in light while keeping out the worst of the cold. A chimney was luxury. Many cabins started with simple holes in the roof to vent smoke. You coughed a lot. Inside, the family slept on piles of straw, furs, or corn husks. Beds were made from rope strung across wooden frames. If you were lucky, the gaps between logs were sealed with mud and moss to keep out the wind. If you weren't, the wind came in anyway. And then came the first winter, the season that tested every soul. If the family hadn't stored enough firewood or food, the months ahead could mean starvation or frostbite. Snowstorms might trap them inside for days. Coyotes howled in the dark. Wolves circled, but still the frontier spirit endured. Families made candles from animal fat. Children learned to patch clothes and cook over open fires. They read from the Bible by firelight. They wrote letters home if there was a place to send them. Neighbors were few and far between. But when a new cabin appeared on the horizon, help was offered. A shared roof raising, a borrowed cow, a hot meal. Survival wasn't about toughness. It was about community. One family couldn't last, but 10 might. The first winter on the frontier wasn't just cold. It was a quiet crucible where dreams were either hardened into resolve or buried beneath the snow. On the American frontier, strength wasn't measured in muscle alone. It was measured in endurance, sacrifice, and quiet, relentless courage. And no one embodied that more than frontier women. Forget the dainty damsels of dime novels. These women were warriors in aprons. The moment they stepped off the wagon, they became builders, farmers, midwives, butchers, doctors, and teachers, all wrapped into one. If something needed doing, they did it because there was no one else. They woke before dawn to churn butter, bake bread, and milk cows, all before most men even rubbed their eyes. They planted gardens, preserved food, tended to livestock, and sewed everything the family wore, often from scratch. In times of sickness, they administered herbal remedies. In childbirth, they acted as midwives, sometimes for neighbors, sometimes for themselves alone. A woman on the frontier could kill a snake with a shovel in the morning and teach her children to read by afternoon. She might lose a child to fever and still have dinner on the table by sundown. Guns were no stranger to their hands, if their husbands were away or gone for good. Women defended the homestead with whatever was available. Rifles, axes, frying pans. There are stories of women fending off wolves, outlaws, and even raiders, all while holding a baby on one hip. Loneliness was the enemy, too. For some, the nearest neighbor might be miles away. Letters took weeks, even months, to arrive. The silence could be deafening, and yet these women endured knitting civilization from wilderness. One stitch, one lesson, one loaf at a time. Frontier women also formed the heart of community. They organized barn raisings, cared for sick neighbors, and hosted Sunday gatherings when churches were still only blueprints. When towns finally sprang up, it was often the women who insisted on schools, libraries, and law. They weren't background characters in the story of the frontier. They were the backbone. Uncelebrated, overworked, and often overlooked, yet impossible to forget once you knew their strength. So the next time you picture the Wild West, don't just think of cowboys on horses. Think of a woman, hair pinned back, sleeves rolled up, shotgun by the door, and cornbread in the oven. For every wagon that rolled westward, for every cabin raised and field plowed, there was already someone there. The American frontier wasn't empty. It was occupied by hundreds of indigenous nations who had called the land home for centuries, even millennia. From the Great Plains to the Pacific coast, the land was deeply woven with native life. Hunting grounds, sacred sites, migration paths, rivers filled with meaning. But to the U.S. government and to most pioneers, this wasn't seen as home. It was seen as potential. And so began a long, painful unraveling of promises. The U.S. government signed treaty after treaty with native tribes, agreements that promised peace, land rights, and resources. But almost every one of these treaties was broken. As settlers poured westward, tribes were pushed back, then pushed again. Sometimes it was with ink, sometimes with fire and bullets. Entire nations were forced onto reservations, often barren and far from ancestral homes. The Cherokee, Choctaw, Lakota, Comanche, and dozens more were made strangers on their own land. Some native groups tried diplomacy, others resisted. Armed conflicts erupted. The Black Hawk War, the Sand Creek Massacre, Little Bighorn. But even when native warriors won a battle, they lost the war. The government simply kept coming, with troops, with railroads, with settlers hungry for space and willing to claim it at any cost. It wasn't just a land grab. It was cultural erasure. Children were taken from families, sent to boarding schools where they were punished for speaking their languages. Sacred traditions were outlawed. Native identity was treated as something to be erased, civilized, or rewritten. And yet, through it all, indigenous peoples survived. Their languages were whispered in secret. Their songs were sung in defiance. Their stories passed down like living fire. The romantic image of the frontier often forgets this cost, but the truth remains. Westward expansion was not a triumph for all. For many, it was a slow, devastating march of loss. To understand the American frontier is to hold both truths at once, the resilience of pioneers and the tragedy of the people they displaced. Because history, like the land itself, holds more than one story. On the American frontier, law and order arrived late, and sometimes not at all. In many newly settled towns, there were no police, no courthouses, and no jails. Justice was less about due process, and more about who had the loudest voice, the fastest draw, or the biggest gang behind them. In short, the law on the frontier wore many faces, and not all of them were good guys. At first, it was the vigilantes who stepped in. Citizens' committees would form when a crime was committed. A horse stolen, a shop robbed, or worse. They held makeshift trials in saloons or under trees. And if guilt was assumed, punishment came fast. A bullet, a rope, or being run out of town with a warning and a bruised ego. Eventually, the towns grew, and with them came lawmen, sheriffs, marshals, and deputies. Names like Wyatt Earp, Bat Masterson, and Wild Bill Hickok became legend. Some were brave, some were crooked. Most were a little of both. With a tin badge and a revolver, they were the thin line between chaos and order. But just as quickly as the lawmen arrived, so did the outlaws. The frontier was a magnet for drifters, deserters, gamblers, and gunslingers looking to vanish into the dust. Men like Billy the Kid, Jesse James, and Butch Cassidy didn't just rob banks and trains. They captured imaginations. Newspapers turned them into folk heroes, even as they left trails of bodies and broken safes behind. Frontier justice was unpredictable. A man could be hanged for stealing a horse or walk free after a murder if the jury liked his story better. Bribes worked. So did threats. And sometimes justice was just revenge and a fancier hat. Even the courtroom, when it existed, was often little more than a general store with a judge who also ran the hardware counter. Despite the chaos, or maybe because of it, frontier communities slowly built systems of law. Judges replaced vigilantes. Prisons replaced tree limbs, but the myths never died. And maybe they never will. Because on the edge of the known world, justice wasn't blind. It was armed, dusty, and didn't ask twice. At first, the American frontier moved at the speed of a wagon wheel. Slow, creaky, and weather permitting. But by the mid to late 1800s, the silence of the prairie was shattered by a new sound. The steam whistle. The arrival of the railroad changed everything. Suddenly, journeys that once took months by wagon could be completed in days. The Transcontinental Railroad, completed in 1869, connected east to west in a steel embrace that transformed the frontier from wilderness into a corridor of commerce. Settlers flooded in. Towns popped up overnight beside new depots and goods. Everything from stoves to sewing needles arrived by train, no longer hoarded or handmade. For pioneers, the railroad meant survival. It meant medicine could arrive before a fever turned deadly. It meant crops could be sold beyond the local market. It meant letters, long delayed by weather and rivers, could now travel in days. The frontier became less of a gamble and more of a calculated risk. But the railroad didn't come alone. Alongside it ran the telegraph wire, thin humming strands of copper that stitched the country together with dots and dashes. The telegraph gave the frontier something it had never had before: instant communication. A rancher in Wyoming could get news of a presidential election within minutes. A sheriff could call for help from 100 miles away. Isolation, the great fear of the early pioneer, was dying one beep at a time. The impact was huge. Economies expanded. Government reached farther. Law enforcement got faster. But not everyone welcomed it. Indigenous tribes saw railroads and telegraph poles as intrusions, signals that the land they once roamed freely was now bound by wires and owned in sections. Some fought back, sabotaging lines, derailing trains, delaying the inevitable. Yet progress rolled on. The iron horse was unstoppable. Towns that the railroad skipped were left to wither. Others boomed, becoming cities almost overnight. The wilderness was shrinking mile by mile, rail by rail. And while the frontier spirit didn't disappear, it was no longer isolated. It was plugged in, connected, and commercialized. The frontier was still wild, but now it ran on steam and signals. By the end of the 19th century, something profound had changed. The line that once separated wilderness from settlement, the famed frontier line, had blurred, faded, and finally disappeared. In 1890, the U.S. Census Bureau officially declared, "There can hardly be said to be a frontier line." In other words, the American frontier was closed. The great push westward was over. The forests had been cleared. The railroads linked coast to coast. The buffalo were nearly gone. Tribes were confined to reservations. The land, once vast and mysterious, had been measured, mapped, and sold by the acre. But what did that mean? For some, it meant victory. The dream had been realized, a continent tamed, a nation stretched from sea to sea. For others, especially native peoples and displaced communities, it meant erasure, loss, and a bitter silence where homelands had once been. Yet, the end of the frontier wasn't just about geography. It was about identity. The rugged individualism, the myth of the lone pioneer, the campfire stories of heroism and hardship. These didn't vanish. They became legend. Writers like Frederick Jackson Turner argued that the frontier had shaped the very soul of America, its democracy, its grit, its restlessness. The frontier taught Americans to adapt, to survive, to rely on themselves and their neighbors. It gave birth to the cowboy, the log cabin president, the gold rush prospector, all icons woven into the fabric of national myth. But the reality was Messier. The frontier was sweat, dirt, disease, and death. It was brave and brutal, hopeful and unjust. It was full of contradictions, and its legacy remains a reflection of that tension. Today, the frontier lives on, not in geography, but in spirit, in the idea that pushing into the unknown, whether it's land, science, or space, defines what it means to be American. The wagons no longer roll. The cabins are museums. The trails are highways. But if you listen closely, you can still hear echoes in the prairie wind, carried on stories passed down from those who dared to go farther. The American frontier didn't vanish. It became the foundation. Even before there were instruments, there was rhythm, the beat of a foot on earth, the clap of two hands, the thump of a heart in a quiet chest. Music did not begin with wood or string or bone. It began with the body. It began with breath. Tens of thousands of years ago, long before writing, agriculture, or architecture, early humans discovered something extraordinary in sound. In caves and on plains, around fires and in forests, they discovered that certain movements, a stomp, a shout, a whistle, could stir emotion, call attention, or even comfort fear. Music, it seems, is not a cultural invention. It is a biological instinct. Imagine a small group of hunter-gatherers huddled in the flickering light of a fire. One begins to hum, a low rising tone. Another claps in rhythm. A third starts to mimic bird calls. There are no words, just sound. And in that moment, they are no longer just individuals surviving the elements. They are connected, they are human. Before the flute, before the drum, sound itself was sacred. Many anthropologists believe that early music may have emerged from imitation, copying animal calls for hunting or mimicking natural sounds to communicate across distances. But at some point, these sounds crossed the line from utility to expression. A rhythm became more than a signal. It became a language of emotion. A hum became a lullaby. A scream became a song. There's a theory that music came before language, or at least alongside it. That before we spoke, we sang. Infants, even today, respond more instinctively to tone and melody than to speech. Something about pitch, rhythm, and vibration is hardwired into us. We didn't just invent music, we remembered it. And perhaps most beautifully, these first sounds weren't reserved for the elite or the gifted. They were universal, a shared experience of early humans across continents. Music was made in Africa, Asia, Europe. Anywhere there were voices and hands, and something to strike or shake. Before the first flute was carved from bone, before strings were stretched and drums were skinned, humans already knew sound could move the soul. And that was just the beginning. In the chill of Ice Age Europe, where mammoths roamed and glaciers carved the land, a quiet revolution took place, not in tools or fire, but in sound. Somewhere in a cave, an early human picked up a hollow bird bone, bored a few holes into it, and blew. Out came a tone, pure, haunting, intentional. This was no accident. This was the birth of the musical instrument. Archaeologists have uncovered bone flutes dating back over 40,000 years, making them some of the oldest known instruments on Earth. Found in sites like the Hohl Fels cave in Germany, these flutes were made from vulture wing bones or mammoth ivory. Not easy materials to work with, but their makers took the time to carve finger holes at precise intervals, allowing for a range of notes. That precision tells us something profound. This wasn't random. It was music, structured, repeatable, crafted for expression. Why did they do it? Perhaps the sound mimicked birdsong, a call to nature. Perhaps it accompanied rituals, marking the transition from life to death or the passage of seasons. Or maybe, just maybe, someone made a flute because they wanted to make beauty in the darkness. It's easy to think of prehistoric humans as crude, focused solely on survival, but the flute suggests otherwise. It speaks of creativity, of a mind that looked at a bone and didn't see food, but possibility. These instruments also imply community. A flute played alone makes music, yes, but in a group, it creates rhythm, harmony, and shared experience. Around a fire, flutes may have joined voices, clapping or drumming on logs and stones. The music would rise, echoing off cave walls, the first concerts in human history. And consider this, these Ice Age flutes predate the invention of agriculture, the wheel, and even writing. In the hierarchy of innovation, music came early, not as a luxury, but as a need. The flutes of the Ice Age weren't just tools. They were expressions of joy, sorrow, mystery, and ritual. Fragile whispers from the deep past, still capable of moving us today. From bone and breath, humanity made melody. If the flute was our first voice, then the drum was our heartbeat. Long before cities, long before kings, there were circles of people gathered under stars, clapping, stomping, and pounding rhythm into the ground. The drum wasn't invented in one place. It emerged everywhere across continents and cultures, as if the human body and Earth itself were asking to be synchronized. The earliest drums were likely simple stretched animal skin over a hollow log or clay pot. They were tools of rhythm, yes, but also of ritual, communication, and power. A drum beat could summon a god, lead an army, or call a village together. It wasn't just noise, it was a signal. In Africa, some of the oldest known drum traditions trace back tens of thousands of years. There, drums became voices, instruments that could speak tonal languages, mimicking human phrases. In Siberia, shamans used drums to enter trances, their rhythms unlocking gateways to the spirit world. In the Amazon, the sound of a water drum echoed through the jungle like thunder made by human hands. What made the drum so essential wasn't just its sound, but its universality. You didn't need melody. You didn't need formal training. You just needed to feel the beat. And feel it we did. Drums were used in birth ceremonies, funerals, weddings, harvests, and wars. Their pulse gave structure to chaos. A rhythm could bind a tribe together, unify a ritual, or prepare warriors for battle. The beat said, "We are one." Even in early agriculture, drumming had a place. Farmers beat sticks to scare away birds. Harvest festivals featured dances led by drum beats. Rhythm marked time. Not just hours, but seasons, cycles, and transitions. Over time, drums evolved. People added carvings, paint, and spiritual symbols to their instruments. Drums were not just functional. They were sacred objects representing fertility, protection, or divine connection. And always they connected us across language barriers, across generations, across worlds. In a world before clocks, electricity, or writing, rhythm was how we counted and how we felt. Drums brought sound to life. They made time tangible, and in their pounding, we found not just music, we found meaning. As humanity moved from caves to cities, music evolved from survival ritual into sophisticated art. Nowhere was this more evident than in ancient Mesopotamia, the cradle of civilization, where rivers, carved kingdoms, and writing was born. Here, music began to look elegant. Among the temples and ziggurats, we find some of the earliest depictions of stringed instruments, harps and lyres drawn on tablets, carved into walls, and even buried with kings. These weren't bone flutes made in secret. They were crafted with care, adorned with gold, silver, and lapis lazuli, their curves as graceful as their sound. The harp, in particular, became a symbol of refinement, religion, and royalty. In the city of dating back over 4,500 years, archaeologists uncovered the famous bull-headed lyre buried beside the tomb of a noble woman. Its body was inlaid with gold, and its face crowned with a golden bull's head. Not just an instrument, but a myth in wood and string. These early harps didn't have frets or fingerboards. Strings were plucked by hand, and each tone was fixed. But what they lacked in flexibility, they made up for in atmosphere. A Mesopotamian harp didn't shout like a drum, it whispered. Its notes hung in the air like incense, sacred, dreamlike. In these cities, music became organized. Musicians were trained. Scales and intervals were recorded in cuneiform. The harp was used in ceremonies, storytelling, and even astronomy, as scholars mapped the stars and matched them to harmonies, believing the heavens themselves sang in celestial intervals. The presence of harps in Mesopotamian burial sites tells us something profound. Music was believed to follow the soul beyond death. It wasn't just entertainment. It was spiritual architecture building bridges between worlds. And unlike the thunder of drums or the primal howl of flutes, harps brought a new quality to music. Intimacy, soft, thoughtful, deliberate. For the first time, perhaps sound was not just for the gods or the tribe. It was for reflection. With a stretched string and a wooden frame, Mesopotamians gave voice to silence. And from that silence, the first melodies of civilization were born. In ancient Egypt, music wasn't just an art. It was a divine language. The Egyptians believed that music was a gift from the gods. According to myth, it was the goddess Bat, later merged with Hathor, the goddess of joy, fertility, and music, who first brought song into the world. And so, music became more than melody. It was ritual, identity, and spiritual architecture, resonating through temples, tombs, and marketplaces alike. Unlike the primal flutes of prehistory or the ceremonial harps of Mesopotamia, Egyptian music blended ritual precision with everyday life. Workers sang to keep rhythm as they built pyramids. Fishermen sang to the Nile. Priests performed hymns during sacred rites. Women played frame drums and rattles during childbirth and funerals, moments of beginning and end. The most iconic Egyptian instruments were harps, lutes, lyres, cymbals, and flutes. Harps evolved from simple angular shapes to large curved decorative pieces with long arched necks, symbols of status as much as sound. Some had up to 22 strings crafted with such elegance that they appear in tomb paintings, still vivid 3,000 years later. The cymbal, however, held a unique place, a type of rattle with metal rods that jingled when shaken. It was closely associated with goddess worship, especially that of Hathor and Isis. The sound wasn't meant for amusement. It was meant to awaken the divine, to shake off evil, and to protect the soul during ceremonies. Musicians in Egypt weren't always commoners. Some were priests or priestesses serving in temples through music. Others were court musicians, entertaining pharaohs and foreign dignitaries with songs praising gods, kings, and legacy. Music also bridged worlds. In funerals, songs and chants guided the soul through the underworld. Tombs of the wealthy often included lyrics and even illustrations of instruments and musicians, as if to ensure the departed would be accompanied by sound in the afterlife. For ancient Egyptians, music was eternal. It honored the gods, unified the people, and reminded them of cosmic order. Mat rhythm wasn't chaos. It was the heartbeat of the universe. In Egypt, to make music was to echo the sacred. To the ancient Greeks, music wasn't just an art form. It was a science of the soul and of the universe itself. While other civilizations used music in ritual and celebration, the Greeks asked a deeper question: why does sound move us? And their answer was found not just in poetry or philosophy, but in mathematics. Enter Pythagoras, the philosopher best known today for his triangle, but who also played a monumental role in the origins of music theory. According to legend, Pythagoras passed a blacksmith's shop and noticed something strange. The sound of hammer strikes changed depending on the size and weight of the hammers. This inspired an experiment with strings. He discovered that when a string was divided in simple ratios like 1 to 2, 2 to 3, or 3 to 4, it produced consonant harmonious tones. This revelation birthed the idea of the harmony of the spheres, the belief that the cosmos itself operated on mathematical ratios, and that music was an echo of universal order. Every plucked string wasn't just a note, it was a mirror of the heavens. Greek instruments reflected this philosophy. The lyre, a small harp-like instrument, became a symbol of civilization and education. Poets like Homer and Sappho were often depicted with one in hand. The outlaws, a double reed pipe, provided the wild emotive contrast, played in dramas, rituals, and sometimes in war. Music in Greece was deeply tied to ethics and character. The philosopher Plato believed different musical modes could influence the soul, some inspiring courage, others promoting laziness or chaos. He advocated for strict musical education to shape ideal citizens. In his view, the wrong scale could be as dangerous as poor governance. But for the Greeks, music wasn't about entertainment alone. It was medicine, it was morality, it was mathematical perfection, vibrating through flesh and air. They laid the foundations for music theory, notation systems, and acoustics. Their understanding of intervals, scales, and harmony would echo for centuries through Roman, medieval, and modern thought. In Greece, music became more than sound. It became a bridge between reason and emotion, between numbers and beauty, a place where the soul could both calculate and soar. If Greece gave music its philosophy, Rome gave it volume. In the Roman world, music was about function, form, and force. It accompanied festivals, religious ceremonies, gladiator games, and most famously, the battlefield. Where the Greeks saw music as a bridge to the divine, the Romans saw it as a tool of order and empire. One of the most iconic instruments of Roman power was the cornu, a massive curved brass horn shaped like a G and often taller than the soldier who carried it. The cornu wasn't for melody. It was for command. Its blast signaled troop movements, battle charges, and retreat orders across noisy battlefields. Roman generals didn't just shout, they orchestrated war. Alongside the cornu was the tuba, no relation to the modern one, a straight trumpet that could cut through the chaos of combat. Together, these instruments helped keep the Roman army, the most disciplined force in the world, moving in sync. Imagine tens of thousands of soldiers marching in time to the brassy, haunting calls of these ancient horns. It wasn't just organization. It was psychological warfare. But Roman music wasn't all military. In temples, tibiae, double flutes, accompanied sacred rites. In arenas, music opened gladiator games, not unlike a modern national anthem before a sporting event. At banquets, lyres and hydraulis, an early water-powered pipe organ, created ambience for elite guests. Music flowed through Roman daily life like wine, structured, performative, essential. They borrowed heavily from the Greeks, but reworked everything to fit their own ethos. Where Greece emphasized individual expression and introspection, Rome emphasized public spectacle and control. Music was entertainment and propaganda. And when Rome absorbed Egypt, Judea, Gaul, and beyond, it absorbed their sounds too. Roman music became a mosaic, blending African rhythms, Eastern melodies, and Mediterranean instruments into something vast and ever-evolving. Yet, unlike Greek philosophers, Roman thinkers wrote little about the theory of music. They played it, used it, marched to it, but rarely analyzed it. For Rome, sound was a means, not a mystery. In the end, Rome didn't refine music. It amplified it, until even the farthest provinces heard the beat of the empire's drums. While the West marched to the rhythms of empire, the East was exploring something else, the soul of sound. In ancient India, music was not merely an art form. It was a path to the divine. Rooted in the Vedas, some of the oldest sacred texts in existence, Indian music began as chant. The Samaveda in particular was a collection of hymns designed not just to be read, but sung. These chants followed intricate melodic patterns called swaras, meant to elevate consciousness and harmonize the universe. As Indian civilization evolved, so did its instruments. The veena, an early stringed instrument, became associated with Saraswati, goddess of knowledge and the arts. The mridangam, a barrel-shaped drum, kept time during sacred performances. Every note, every rhythm was tied to ragas and talas, melodic and rhythmic frameworks believed to evoke specific emotions, times of day, even spiritual states. Music wasn't for entertainment. It was discipline, meditation, a way to balance inner energies and touch the eternal. Meanwhile, in ancient China, music was equally sacred, but also political. The legendary Emperor Shun, one of China's mythical 5 emperors, was said to have harmonized the empire through music. Chinese philosophy, especially Confucianism, held that proper music led to moral behavior and social order. The right notes created harmony, not just in the soul, but in the state. Instruments were carefully designed to reflect cosmic balance. The guqin, a 7-stringed zither, was played in solitude by scholars and sages. Its soft meditative tones were meant to reflect introspection and virtue. The sheng, a mouth-blown reed instrument, symbolized unity through its many pipes working as one. The bianzhong, a set of bronze bells, was used in royal courts to represent hierarchy and ritual structure. Chinese music was tuned to precise mathematical intervals that matched natural cycles, aligning humanity with the heavens. In both India and China, music was not separate from life. It was life, a mirror of the cosmos, a code of discipline, a sacred pulse. While Rome used music to conquer, the East used it to commune with the divine, with nature, with the self. From the thrum of bone flutes in Ice Age caves to the shimmering strings of Mesopotamia, from Egyptian cymbals that summoned gods to Chinese zithers that calmed emperors, music has always been more than entertainment. It is a language without borders, a force that predates empires and outlasts them. But why has music endured when so many other inventions have faded? Because music speaks directly to something we can't explain, the emotional center of our being. It comforts, warns, excites, unites, mourns. It's what a lullaby offers to a crying child. What a funeral drum says when words fall short. What a national anthem stirs before a battle or a game. Music is intuitive. A melody from the Andes can move someone in Africa. A drumbeat from a Polynesian island might feel familiar to someone in Scandinavia. It's not the notes we recognize. It's the feeling they carry. And music is flexible. It adapts. It absorbs. It survives colonization, migration, war, and revolution. Instruments cross oceans. Songs change languages. Scales evolve. But the core remains rhythm, tone, expression. Across history, we've used music to define identity. Tribes, nations, religions, revolutions, all have had their songs, but we've also used it to transcend identity, to collaborate, to connect. Music doesn't require a shared tongue. It only requires ears and a heart that listens. Modern science now confirms what ancient wisdom intuited. Music alters brain waves, reduces stress, and triggers memory. Alzheimer's patients, even when words vanish, remember melodies. Soldiers cope with trauma through sound. Babies respond to lullabies before they can speak. We've turned music into therapy, into protest, into worship, into business, into life. In a world fractured by language, belief, and geography, music remains a rare constant, a human signature that traces back to our earliest ancestors, blowing into bird bones and thumping rhythm into stone. No matter how far we advance in AI, in space, in technology, music reminds us of our origins. It reminds us that we are not machines. We are feeling, thinking, dreaming beings. And as long as we live, we will keep making music. Because long before we had stories to tell, we had sound. And sound made us human.